Hey guys, tonight we begin with a question that's probably crossed your mind while watching some sword and sandal epic. You see Russell Crowe swing his gladius with righteous fury, you watch Spartacus rally his brothers in arms, and you think gladiators were these noble warriors fighting for honor and glory, heroes of the arena, right? Masters of combat who lived and died by the sword in glorious battle. You probably wouldn't last a single day. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know in the comments what other dark corners of history you'd like me to drag you through. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations! You've just woken up in ancient Rome, and you're a gladiator. The romantic notion of the noble warrior? Forget it. You're property. Human livestock bred for entertainment. Welcome to a world where your life expectancy is measured in months, not years. And every sunrise might be your last.
So, how did you end up here? Let's be clear about one thing. You didn't volunteer for this glamorous career. Most gladiators were slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals sentenced to the arena. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of death row, except sometimes you got to live a little longer if you were entertaining enough. Maybe you were a Celtic warrior captured during one of Rome's endless campaigns. One day you're defending your village, the next you're chained to a line of other defeated warriors marching toward Rome. The Romans had a special talent for taking your identity, your freedom, and your dignity, then forcing you to fight for their amusement. Or perhaps you were a criminal. Steal some bread to feed your family? Congratulations, you've just earned yourself a one-way ticket to gladiator school. Murder someone in a fit of rage? Same destination, different backstory. The Romans weren't particularly picky about the details of your crimes. They just needed bodies to fill the arena. The volunteer gladiators, the auctorati, existed, but they were the minority. These were free men who sold themselves into slavery for a fixed period, usually driven by debt, desperation, or the twisted allure of fame. They signed a contract that was essentially a death warrant, with better pay. Even then, once you signed, you were property. The lanista, your owner and trainer, could do whatever he wanted with you. Privacy? What's that? From the moment you entered the ludus, the gladiator school, your life belonged to someone else. You ate when they said eat, slept when they said sleep, and died when they said die. Your body was an investment, and investments needed to be protected until it was time to cash them in. The recruitment process was brutal and dehumanizing. New arrivals were inspected like livestock, their muscles tested, their reflexes evaluated, their potential for entertainment assessed. The weak were sent to the mines or crucified, the strong were branded and thrown into training. There was no middle ground, no participation trophy, no second chances. Welcome to your new home. And by home, I mean prison. The ludus wasn't some warrior monastery where noble fighters honed their craft. It was a combination training facility, barracks, and tomb. The walls were high, the guards were armed, and escape was virtually impossible. Your cell was roughly the size of a modern bathroom, if that bathroom had stone walls, no windows, and a dirt floor. You shared the space with maybe one other gladiator, assuming you were lucky. Privacy was a luxury for Romans, not their property. The smell was a constant companion. Unwashed bodies, human waste, fear, and the metallic scent of blood from the training grounds. The daily routine was designed to break you down and build you back up as a killing machine. Dawn brought the sound of guards banging on bars, dragging you from whatever restless sleep you'd managed to find. Breakfast was a bowl of barley gruel, maybe some beans if you were fortunate. Nutrition was about keeping you alive and functional, not about your comfort or enjoyment. Training began immediately after the meal. The lanista and his trainers, often former gladiators themselves, would work you until your muscles screamed and your vision blurred. You learned to fight with specific weapons. Maybe you were designated a retiarius with net and trident, or a secutor with sword and shield. Your fighting style wasn't chosen based on your preferences or natural abilities. It was determined by what would create the most entertaining spectacle. The wooden swords used in training were called rudis, and they were heavier than real weapons. This wasn't kindness, it was conditioning. When you finally got to hold a real gladius, it would feel light and quick in your hands. Every detail was calculated to maximize your effectiveness in the arena. Lunch was more gruel, perhaps with some meat if you'd shown promise in training. The afternoon brought more combat practice, weapon maintenance, and physical conditioning. The Romans understood that spectacle required skill, and skill required endless repetition. You practiced the same moves thousands of times until they became muscle memory. Evenings were for rest, if you could manage it. The ludus never truly slept. Guards patrolled constantly, and the sound of someone crying, praying, or having nightmares was a constant background noise. Some gladiators found solace in gambling, others in makeshift religions or superstitions. Most just stared at the walls and wondered how many sunrises they had left. Forget everything you think you know about ancient warrior nutrition. You weren't eating lean meats and fresh vegetables like some Mediterranean fitness influencer. Your diet was specifically designed to make you bigger, slower, and more resilient to cuts. Basically, better television. The gladiator diet was heavy on barley, beans, and other grains. They called gladiators hordieri, barley eaters. This wasn't an insult, it was a description. Barley was cheap, filling, and created a layer of subcutaneous fat that would make sword cuts less likely to reach vital organs. When you got sliced open in the arena, the crowd wanted to see blood, not immediate death. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of feeding cattle before slaughter. You were being fattened up to make a better show. The extra weight also made you slower and more deliberate in your movements, which meant longer, more dramatic fights. Quick, decisive kills were boring. The crowd wanted to see struggle. They wanted to see suffering. They wanted to see the fight last long enough to build tension. Meat was rare and usually consisted of scraps. Organ meat, gristle, whatever the regular Roman citizens wouldn't eat. Fish was occasionally available, but it was typically the cheap, oily varieties. Vegetables were limited to whatever could be grown cheaply in bulk. Onions, garlic, legumes. Fresh fruit was almost non-existent. The training regimen was equally calculated. You weren't building the lean, athletic physique of a modern fighter. You were building mass and endurance. The wooden training weapons were deliberately heavier than combat weapons, conditioning your muscles to handle the real thing with greater speed and control. Physical conditioning included running, but not the kind of running you might expect. It was more like weighted marching, designed to build leg strength and stamina rather than speed. You practiced combat moves until your form was perfect. Not because perfection was beautiful, but because sloppy technique got you killed before the crowd had their money's worth of entertainment. The weapons and armor weren't chosen by you, for you, or with your survival in mind. They were selected to create the most visually appealing and dramatically satisfying combat for the audience. Each gladiator type had specific equipment designed to create interesting matchups and prolonged fights. As a retiarius, you might be armed with a net, a trident, and a dagger. No armor, except for a piece of metal protecting your left arm and shoulder. You were the fisherman, supposedly catching your opponent like a fish. The lack of armor made you faster, but more vulnerable. Every movement was visible to the crowd. Every wound would bleed dramatically. If you were a secutor, you got a gladius, a large rectangular shield, and a helmet with tiny eye holes. The helmet was designed to protect you from the retiarius's net while severely limiting your vision. You were the pursuer, the heavy fighter, slower but more protected. The helmet also muffled your voice, making your death cries less human and more theatrical. The Murmillo fought with sword and shield, wearing a distinctive helmet with a fish-shaped crest. The Thrax carried a curved sword and a small shield, with armor on both legs. Each style had advantages and disadvantages, carefully balanced to ensure that no single type dominated. Your weapons were maintained by specialists, kept sharp and in perfect condition. This wasn't about giving you the best tools for survival. It was about ensuring that when you hit your opponent, the wound would be clean, dramatic, and bloody. Dull weapons made for boring fights and disappointed crowds. The armor was often more ceremonial than protective. It was designed to look impressive while leaving vital areas exposed for maximum dramatic effect. A chest piece might protect your heart, but leave your arms vulnerable. A helmet might protect your head, but restrict your vision. Every piece of equipment was a compromise between protection and spectacle. Training with these weapons was intensive and specific. You didn't learn general combat skills. You learned how to fight as your particular gladiator type against specific opponents. A retiarius trained differently than a secutor because they had completely different roles in the arena drama that would unfold.
You weren't just a fighter. You were a commodity, an investment, a piece of entertainment property with a fluctuating market value. The economics of gladiatorial combat were complex and brutal, and understanding them helps explain why your life was structured the way it was. A good gladiator was expensive. The initial purchase price, training costs, food, housing, medical care, and equipment represented a significant investment for the lanista. You were like a racehorse, valuable as long as you could perform, worthless the moment you couldn't. This created a perverse incentive structure where your owner wanted you to survive long enough to recoup his investment, but not so long that you became too expensive to maintain. The lanista rented you out to whoever was sponsoring the games. This might be a wealthy politician trying to win votes, a magistrate fulfilling civic duties, or even the emperor himself. The rental fee depended on your skill level, your reputation, and your entertainment value. Famous gladiators commanded higher prices, which meant they were both more valuable and more likely to be pushed into increasingly dangerous situations. Your training and maintenance costs were constantly weighed against your earning potential. Food was calculated to maximize your fighting ability at minimum cost. Medical care was provided only to the extent necessary to keep you functional. If the cost of keeping you alive exceeded your potential earnings, you might find yourself facing increasingly hopeless matches until the problem resolved itself. The betting market around gladiatorial combat was enormous. Wealthy Romans wagered fortunes on individual fights, creating additional pressure for exciting, unpredictable outcomes. A gladiator who won too easily or too consistently might find himself facing multiple opponents or fighting with deliberately inferior equipment to even the odds. Prize money existed for winning gladiators, but it was a small fraction of what the lanista earned from your performances. Most of it went toward better food, small luxuries, or saving toward the theoretical possibility of buying your freedom. The system made it clear that freedom was a carrot dangled to encourage better performance, not a realistic goal for most gladiators. Successful gladiators could earn enough to eventually purchase their freedom, but the system was designed to make this extremely difficult. Just as you accumulated enough money, you might be forced into a particularly expensive match, or your winnings might be confiscated for various infractions. The house always had ways to ensure the house won.
The arena wasn't just a fighting ground, it was a carefully designed theater of death, engineered to maximize the psychological impact on both the fighters and the spectators. Every architectural detail served the larger purpose of creating an unforgettable spectacle of human suffering. The Colosseum could hold 50,000 spectators, all of them there to watch you die. The seating was arranged by social class, with the emperor and senators closest to the action, common citizens in the middle tiers, and slaves and foreigners in the highest, cheapest seats. Everyone had a clear view of the arena floor, where you would bleed. Beneath the arena floor was a complex network of tunnels, chambers, and mechanical devices called the hypogeum. This underground maze housed wild animals, gladiators, and the stage machinery that could raise you into the arena through trapdoors. The floor itself was covered with sand, not for your comfort, but to absorb the blood and make cleanup easier between fights. The sound design was as important as the visual spectacle. The arena's shape naturally amplified the sounds of combat, the clash of weapons, the grunt of effort, the scream of pain. Your death cries would echo through the stone structure, reaching every spectator clearly. The crowd's roar would bounce back down to you, a constant reminder of how many people were actively hoping to watch you die. The holding cells beneath the arena were deliberately cramped and terrifying. You waited in darkness, listening to the sounds of combat above, knowing that each cheer from the crowd meant another gladiator had fallen. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical violence. Fear was part of the entertainment. Water could be pumped into the arena for naval battles, turning the space into a temporary lake where you might be forced to fight on ships. Wild animals could be released through the trapdoors, creating chaos and unpredictability. The architecture was designed to surprise and horrify, keeping both fighters and spectators on edge. The arena could be covered with an enormous awning called the velarium, protecting the spectators from sun and rain while you fought in whatever weather conditions the gods provided. Their comfort was assured, yours was irrelevant. The contrast was deliberate. They sat in cushioned seats eating delicacies while you struggled for your life in the sand below.
Your training wasn't about making you an effective warrior. It was about making you an effective entertainer who happened to kill people. The distinction is crucial because it explains why gladiatorial combat looked nothing like real warfare and everything like deadly theater. The morning training session began with wooden weapons against wooden posts. You practiced the same combinations hundreds of times until they became automatic. But these weren't necessarily the most effective killing techniques. They were the most visually impressive ones. A quick thrust to the heart might end a fight efficiently, but it wouldn't give the crowd the prolonged struggle they'd paid to see. Footwork was emphasized heavily, not just for tactical advantage, but for dramatic effect. The way you moved around the arena, how you circled your opponent, how you retreated and advanced, all of this was choreographed to create maximum tension. You learned to fight in a way that would build suspense, not simply win quickly. Combat techniques were specialized for your gladiator type and designed to create interesting matchups. Aretiarius learned to use his net not just to entangle opponents, but to create moments of high drama when the crowd held its breath wondering if the net would hold. A Secutor learned to use his shield not just for protection, but to create satisfying clashing sounds when weapons struck it. Grappling and wrestling were taught, but again with entertainment value in mind. A good wrestling match could last several minutes, with both fighters straining against each other while the crowd built to a fever pitch.
The techniques emphasized holds and positions that would be visible to the entire audience, not necessarily the most effective ones. You practiced dying. This wasn't a joke or an exaggeration. There were specific ways to fall, specific ways to accept defeat, specific ways to die that would satisfy the crowd's expectations. A gladiator who died well might be remembered fondly. One who died poorly might be forgotten immediately, his death meaningless, even by the standards of gladiatorial combat. The training weapons were deliberately heavier than real ones, but they were also designed to be less lethal. Training deaths were expensive and counterproductive. You learned to fight with sufficient skill to put on a good show without killing your training partners before they could earn money in the arena.
Living as a gladiator required a complete restructuring of your relationship with death, pain, and hope. The psychological adaptations necessary for survival were as brutal as the physical ones, and they changed you in ways that made returning to normal life almost impossible. You learned to compartmentalize fear, not overcome it. That was impossible when you knew each day might be your last. Instead, you learned to function despite constant, overwhelming terror. Some gladiators developed elaborate rituals before fights, not because they were superstitious, but because routine provided the illusion of control in a situation where you had none. The relationship with pain became complex. You learned to distinguish between injuries that would end your fighting career and ones that would just make you suffer. A cut that looked dramatic but missed vital organs was preferable to a small wound that severed something important. You developed an almost clinical awareness of your own body's vulnerabilities. Hope was your enemy and your salvation. Too much hope made the reality of your situation unbearable. Too little hope made you careless and ineffective. The psychological sweet spot was a kind of fatalistic acceptance combined with tactical optimism about individual fights. You couldn't think about long-term survival, but you could focus on winning the next match. Relationships with other gladiators were complicated by the knowledge that you might be forced to kill each other. Friendships formed despite this reality, but they were always shadowed by the possibility of future conflict. Some gladiators dealt with this by becoming emotionally numb. Others formed intense, almost romantic bonds with their fellow fighters, finding comfort in shared suffering. The crowd's reaction affected your psychology in ways that were difficult to predict. Their cheers when you landed a good hit could be intoxicating, giving you a brief moment of feeling powerful and important. Their disappointment when you fought poorly could be crushing, making you feel like a failure even at the one thing you were forced to do. Sleep was elusive and often filled with nightmares. Many gladiators developed what we might recognize today as symptoms of severe post-traumatic stress. The constant proximity to death, the regular witnessing of extreme violence, and the knowledge that your own death was not just possible, but likely, created psychological trauma that few people could fully process.
When your time came, and it would come, the manner of your death was as scripted and theatrical as everything else about gladiatorial combat. The crowd didn't just want to see you die, they wanted to see you die well, according to their expectations of how a gladiator should face death. The thumbs up or thumbs down from the crowd was real, but it wasn't the simple life or death decision popular culture suggests. The emperor or the sponsor of the games made the final decision, and they considered factors beyond just crowd reaction. A gladiator who had fought well might be spared even if the crowd called for death. One who had disappointed might be killed despite popular support. If you were granted the missio, dismissal from the fight, you lived to fight another day. But this wasn't freedom or even safety. It was just a postponement of the inevitable. Gladiators who received the missio multiple times were often crowd favorites, which meant they were more likely to be matched against increasingly difficult opponents until they finally fell. If the decision was death,
You were expected to die with dignity. This meant kneeling, exposing your throat, and accepting the killing blow without struggling or pleading. A gladiator who died well earned respect from the crowd and his fellow fighters. One who died poorly brought shame to the ludus and was quickly forgotten. The actual killing was typically quick and professional. The winning gladiator would deliver a single efficient blow to the neck or chest, ending your suffering swiftly. This wasn't mercy. It was part of the show. A prolonged, messy death was unsatisfying to the audience and disrespectful to the gladiatorial tradition. Your body was dragged from the arena by slaves dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, or as Mercury, the guide of souls. Even in death, you were part of the theatrical spectacle. The sand was raked smooth, fresh sand was spread over the bloodstains, and the next fight began. Within minutes, it was as if you had never existed. Some gladiators' bodies were claimed by their families or fellow fighters for proper burial. Others were thrown into mass graves or left for wild animals. Your treatment in death depended on your fame, your relationships, and whether anyone cared enough to pay for your burial. Most gladiators simply disappeared, their deaths unmarked and unmourned, except for those who had shared their fate.
Freedom existed for gladiators, but it was so rare and difficult to achieve that it served more as a psychological tool than a realistic goal. The wooden sword, the rudis, was the symbol of manumission, the formal freeing of a slave. But earning it required surviving long enough and fighting well enough to become valuable as a free man. The most common path to freedom was through exceptional performance over many years. A gladiator who consistently won fights, pleased crowds, and generated significant revenue for his lanista might eventually be granted freedom. But this typically required surviving dozens of fights, and the mathematical odds were strongly against long-term survival. Some gladiators earned freedom through a single spectacular performance, saving the life of a fallen opponent, showing exceptional courage against impossible odds, or providing entertainment so memorable that it became legendary could sometimes result in immediate manumission. These cases were rare enough to be recorded by historians, which tells you how unusual they were. Wealthy patrons occasionally purchased the freedom of gladiators who had impressed them, but this was more about the patron's prestige than the gladiator's welfare. Being freed by a powerful Roman created a debt of loyalty that could be more restrictive than slavery in some ways. Even if you achieved freedom, returning to normal life was nearly impossible. The skills you had developed were useful only in the arena. The psychological trauma of years of combat made peaceful civilian life difficult. Many freed gladiators became trainers, guards, or gladiators again, finding that the arena was the only place where they could function. The rudis was often a hollow victory. Freedom meant you were no longer property, but it didn't mean you were accepted in Roman society. Former gladiators faced social stigma, legal restrictions, and economic difficulties. Some found that freedom was lonelier and more uncertain than slavery had been. The promise of freedom served a crucial psychological function in maintaining the gladiatorial system. It provided hope that made the unbearable bearable, motivation that made fighters perform better, and the illusion of choice in a situation where choice had been systematically eliminated. Most gladiators died believing that freedom was possible, even though statistically it was almost impossible. The reality was that gladiatorial combat was designed to consume lives, not preserve them. Your death was the expected outcome from the moment you entered the ludus. Everything else, the training, the food, the medical care, even the possibility of freedom, was just part of the machinery that kept you functional until your inevitable end in the sand.